Edward's fingers traced the velvet box in his coat pocket as he walked through the cobblestone streets of Hatton Garden. The morning air carried the familiar scent of London's autumn, damp leaves and distant exhaust, but all he could focus on was the weight of the diamond ring nestled inside that small blue box. 3 years. 3 years of loving Sophie Hamilton, and today would mark the beginning of forever. The jeweler had assured him it was perfect. A single solitaire, elegant but understated. Exactly what Sophie had described during one of their lazy Sunday morning conversations. She'd been flipping through a magazine, pointing at ostentatious engagement rings with a wrinkled nose. "Too much," she'd said, laughing. "If someone ever proposes to me, I'd want something simple, something that says, 'I love you,' without screaming, 'Look at me.'" Edward had memorized every word. His Kensington apartment reflected his methodical nature, books arranged by subject, bills paid precisely on time, even his coffee cups hung in perfect alignment. But Sophie had brought beautiful chaos into his ordered world. Her reading glasses left on his kitchen counter, her colourful scarves draped over his monochrome furniture, her habit of leaving half-finished crossword puzzles scattered throughout his flat. He loved every disruption she created. The plan had crystallized 3 weeks ago during dinner at her favourite Thai restaurant in Notting Hill. Sophie had mentioned how much she hated the predictability of romance, how she wished someone would surprise her with something completely unexpected. That's when Edward conceived his elaborate surprise. He would disguise himself as a rideshare driver, pick her up from her law firm, and drive her to Launceston Place, the same restaurant where they'd first met when she'd accidentally grabbed his coffee order, and he'd been too smitten to correct her. Edward spent the morning reviewing his strategy. He'd practiced altering his accent slightly, studied the rideshare app interface, even watched YouTube videos about acting natural under pressure. The ring would stay hidden until they reached the restaurant, where he'd reserved their original table, the corner booth where she'd laughed so hard at his terrible joke about legal briefs that she'd snorted wine through her nose. His phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Looking forward to tonight, though you're being very mysterious about where we're going. Should I be worried?" Edward smiled, typing back, "Trust me, it'll be worth the surprise." What Sophie didn't know was that Edward had been planning this moment almost since their second date. He'd saved the menu from their first dinner, the ticket stub from their first cinema visit, even the receipt from the bookshop where they'd spent an entire rainy Saturday browsing together. He was a collector of their moments, a curator of their love story. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Edward changed clothes 3 times, settling on borrowed casual wear from his younger brother Tom, jeans, a plain navy sweater, and worn trainers that would make him invisible in London's sea of working-class faces. He practiced his performance in the mirror, speaking in a slightly rougher accent, slouching his shoulders to appear less polished. At 4:30 p.m., Edward collected the rental car, a modest silver Ford, nothing like his usual BMW. The vehicle smelled of air freshener and previous passengers, a sharp contrast to his pristine personal car. He adjusted the seat, familiarized himself with the controls, and programmed Sophie's office address into the GPS. The drive to her firm took 23 minutes through London's congested streets. Edward parked across from the glass tower where Sophie worked as a junior solicitor, specializing in employment law. He could see her floor from his position, could even make out the faint glow of office lights in the late afternoon darkness. His phone displayed 5:47 p.m. when he saw her emerge from the building's revolving doors. Sophie wore her navy coat, the one he'd bought her last Christmas, and carried her worn leather briefcase. Her dark hair caught the streetlight as she scanned the street for her ride. Edward's heart hammered against his ribs as he activated the rideshare app, watching the small car icon on her phone screen approach her location. This was it. After tonight, everything would change. He would ask the woman he loved more than his own comfort, more than his carefully ordered life, to marry him. Sophie approached the car, her heels clicking against the pavement, completely unaware that her entire future was about to shift in ways neither of them could imagine. "Good evening," Sophie said as she slid into the back seat, bringing with her the familiar scent of her jasmine perfume, mixed with the faint smell of coffee and legal documents. Edward's chest tightened with affection and nerves as he responded in his practiced, rougher accent. "Evening, miss. Notting Hill, yeah?" "That's right," Sophie confirmed, settling her briefcase beside her and pulling out her phone. Edward watched her in the rearview mirror, marveling at how beautiful she looked even after a long day at the firm. Her cheeks were slightly flushed from the cold London air, and she'd loosened her hair from its professional bun, letting it fall in gentle waves around her shoulders. Edward navigated the busy London streets with careful precision, taking a deliberately longer route through Hyde Park Corner and past the Wellington Arch. The Friday evening traffic was his ally tonight. Every red light, every congested roundabout bought him more time with Sophie before revealing his surprise. He'd memorized this route, timing it perfectly to arrive at the restaurant just as the autumn sun began its descent behind the London skyline. "Long day?" Edward asked, maintaining his character while genuinely curious about her work. Sophie had been handling a complex wrongful dismissal case for the past month, and he knew it had been consuming her thoughts. "You could say that," Sophie replied with a tired laugh. "Sometimes I wonder if I chose the right profession." "Do you ever feel that way about your work?" Edward almost broke character, wanting to remind her of their countless conversations about career fulfillment, about how she'd originally wanted to be a teacher before her parents convinced her that law offered more stability. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Every day, miss. But bills need paying, don't they?" The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a successful financial consultant, pretending to be exactly the kind of working-class Londoner Sophie's parents had always worried she might end up with. Her mother, Patricia, had made several pointed comments about Edward's suitability during family dinners, always emphasizing his university education and professional success, as if these were the primary reasons Sophie should love him. As they turned onto Piccadilly, Edward's mind wandered to the ring waiting in his jacket pocket. He'd spent weeks choosing it, visiting 5 different jewelers, consulting with Tom's girlfriend about diamond cuts and settings. The final choice had been instinctive. When he saw this particular ring, he could immediately picture it on Sophie's finger, could imagine her hands gesturing animatedly during one of her passionate speeches about social justice, the diamond catching the light. "The traffic's mental tonight," Edward commented, pausing at yet another red light. Sophie hummed in agreement, and he could see her checking her emails on her phone. This was so typically Sophie, always working, always trying to do more, be better, help more people. It was one of the things he'd fallen in love with, her relentless drive to make the world fairer. "Actually," Sophie said suddenly, "I should call my friend Emma back. She rang earlier, but I was in meetings all afternoon. Do you mind if I take a quick call?" Edward's pulse quickened. This wasn't part of his plan, but he could hardly object without breaking character. "Course not, miss. Take your time." He adjusted the rearview mirror slightly, wanting to watch her face during the conversation. Emma Morrison had been Sophie's best friend since university. Edward had met her countless times at dinner parties and group outings. She was sharp, witty, and refreshingly honest, traits that Sophie clearly valued in their friendship. The phone rang twice before Emma's voice filled the car through Sophie's speaker. "Sophie, finally. I was beginning to think you'd been buried alive under legal briefs." Sophie laughed, the sound warming the car's interior. "Close. This wrongful dismissal case is consuming my soul, but I have exactly 30 minutes before Edward picks me up for our anniversary dinner, so perfect timing." Edward's hands tightened imperceptibly on the steering wheel. He was picking her up, just not in the way she expected. The deception felt thrilling and terrifying simultaneously, like being invisible at his own surprise party. 3 years with Mr. Perfect," Emma said, and Edward could hear the affectionate teasing in her voice. "Are you expecting any major announcements tonight?" Edward held his breath, wondering how Sophie would respond. They'd never explicitly discussed marriage timeline, but he'd dropped enough hints over the past few months that he assumed she was expecting a proposal soon. "God, I hope not," Sophie said with a nervous laugh that made Edward's stomach drop. "I mean, I love Edward, obviously, but I'm nowhere near ready for that conversation." The traffic light turned green, but Edward barely noticed. His carefully planned surprise suddenly felt presumptuous, overwhelming. Had he misread their relationship so completely? The ring in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a solid reminder of assumptions that might be entirely wrong. As they merged into the flow of traffic toward Notting Hill, Edward realized that his perfect plan had just encountered its first major complication. and Sophie had no idea that her boyfriend was listening to every word. "Nowhere near ready." Emma's voice carried surprise and curiosity. "But you two seem so solid. What's holding you back?" Edward's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, every muscle in his body tense as he waited for Sophie's response. The London traffic moved at a crawl around them, brake lights creating a river of red in the gathering dusk. But all Edward could hear was the thundering of his own heartbeat. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and Edward could see her in the rearview mirror, staring out the window at the passing shops and cafes of South Kensington. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability he'd rarely heard before. "I don't know, Em. Sometimes I feel like I'm playing a role in Edward's life, rather than actually living mine." She paused, and Edward had to remind himself to breathe. "Don't get me wrong, he's wonderful. He's successful, generous, treats me well. My parents absolutely adore him. But," Emma prompted gently, "but sometimes I wonder if he loves me, or the version of me he thinks I could become." Sophie's words hit Edward like physical blows. "When we're with his friends from university, I feel like I'm constantly being evaluated. Are my clothes appropriate? Am I contributing intelligently to conversations about wine or art, or whatever cultural touchstone they're discussing?" Edward wanted to interrupt, to tell her that he'd never judged her, that he loved her exactly as she was. But the words caught in his throat as he realized that maybe, unconsciously, he had been guiding her toward his world, rather than embracing hers. "Remember when he suggested I join that book club in Chelsea?" Sophie continued. "It wasn't because I'd expressed interest in book clubs, it was because he thought it would be good for me to meet the right sort of women." His exact words. The memory hit Edward with nauseating clarity. He had said those words, had been so pleased with himself for thinking of ways to help Sophie network and make friends in professional circles. It had never occurred to him how patronizing that must have sounded. "And last month," Sophie's voice grew smaller, "when we went to that gallery opening, he introduced me to everyone as Sophie, my girlfriend who works in employment law, not as Sophie who volunteers at the domestic violence shelter, or Sophie who speaks 3 languages, or Sophie who can fix a leaky tap and make the best carbonara in London. Just employment law, Sophie." Emma made a sympathetic noise. "That sounds frustrating." "It is, and the worst part is that I can feel myself changing to fit his expectations. I find myself Googling wine terminology before dinner parties, practicing opinions about contemporary art, buying clothes that I think will make the right impression on his colleagues." Sophie's laugh was hollow. "I'm becoming someone I don't recognize." The traffic ground to a complete halt near Hyde Park Corner, giving Edward more time to absorb the devastating critique of their relationship. Every word Sophie spoke felt like a revelation about a dynamic he'd been completely blind to. Had he really been so unconsciously controlling? "What about James?" Emma asked suddenly, and Edward's entire world shifted on its axis. There was another long pause before Sophie answered, and Edward could see her fidgeting with her phone in the mirror. "What about James? Come on, Soph, you've mentioned him 3 times in the past month. That's not like you." Emma's voice carried the knowing tone of a friend who'd been paying attention. "He's back in London, isn't he?" Edward's mind raced. James Morrison. Not Emma's brother, but Sophie's ex-boyfriend from university. The one she'd described as her first real love during one of their early conversations about past relationships. Edward had never felt threatened by James because Sophie had made it clear their relationship was ancient history, a fond memory from her youth. "He contacted me a few months ago," Sophie admitted quietly. "He's been working in New York for 3 years, doing sustainable architecture. He got a position with a firm here and we met for coffee, just to catch up." "Just once?" Emma's tone suggested she already knew the answer. "No." Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. "We've met a few times, as friends, Em. Just friends." Edward felt the world tilting around him, the carefully constructed surprise, the months of planning, the ring burning in his pocket. Everything felt suddenly absurd. He was driving his girlfriend to what he'd imagined would be the most romantic night of their lives, while she confessed to maintaining a secret relationship with her ex-boyfriend. "How do you feel when you're with James?" Emma asked gently. The question hung in the air like smoke. Filling the car with tension Edward was certain Sophie must be able to feel. The traffic began moving again, but Edward barely registered the change, completely absorbed in waiting for an answer that he suspected would destroy everything he thought he knew about the woman he loved. Sophie's silence stretched so long that Edward wondered if the call had dropped. He could see her in the mirror, her free hand pressed against her forehead in a gesture he recognized as her thinking pose, the same one she made when working through complicated legal arguments. "When I'm with James," she finally said, her voice soft and distant, "I feel like myself again." The words hit Edward with devastating clarity. Not, "I feel good" or "I feel happy," but "I feel like myself." The implication was clear. With Edward, she felt like someone else. "What do you mean?" Emma asked, though her tone suggested she understood perfectly. "With James, I don't second-guess every word that comes out of my mouth. I don't worry about ordering the wrong wine or not getting the reference to some obscure art movement." Sophie's voice grew stronger, more animated. "Last week we spent 2 hours in a greasy cafe near his office, talking about everything and nothing. He told me about his projects. He's designing affordable housing that incorporates renewable energy systems. I told him about the pro bono case I'm working on, the one Edward thinks is admirable but not career-advancing." Edward's chest constricted. He remembered that conversation, remembered his exact words. He'd been trying to help Sophie think strategically about her career path, but hearing his advice repeated back to him through this lens, it sounded calculating and cold. "James gets excited about the same things I do," Sophie continued. "Social justice, environmental issues, the idea that work should mean something beyond just paying bills. With him, I don't feel like I need to apologize for caring about things that aren't immediately profitable or impressive." "Sounds like you're comparing them," Emma observed carefully. "I suppose I am." Sophie's admission was barely audible, and that's not fair to Edward. "He's a good man, Em. He really is. He's stable, successful, treats me well. He'd be a wonderful husband and father. My parents keep dropping hints about how lucky I am to have found someone so suitable." Edward wanted to scream that he didn't want to be suitable. He wanted to be chosen, loved, desired for who he was rather than what he represented. But he was trapped in his role as the invisible driver, forced to listen to his relationship being dissected. "But," Emma prompted again, "but when James looks at me, he sees the woman I actually am, not the woman I could become with the right guidance and influence." Sophie's voice cracked slightly. "Do you know what he said to me yesterday? He said I was exactly the same person who used to stay up until 3 a.m. arguing about philosophy and social theory, who would rather spend Saturday afternoon volunteering at the community garden than shopping on King's Road. He said he'd missed that person." Edward felt sick. Had he been so focused on integrating Sophie into his world that he'd failed to appreciate the world she came from? Her passion for social causes, her preference for small local restaurants over trendy establishments, her weekend volunteer work. Had he unconsciously tried to minimize these aspects of her personality? "I've been thinking about the future," Sophie continued, "and I realize that when I imagine myself in 10 years, married to Edward, I see a version of myself that feels diminished, like I'd spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of his love, rather than just being loved for who I am." The traffic was moving more smoothly now, carrying them steadily toward Notting Hill and the restaurant where Edward had planned to propose. The irony was suffocating. He was literally driving Sophie toward what he'd imagined would be their happy ending, while listening to her explain why that ending felt wrong to her. "What are you going to do?" Emma asked. "I don't know." Sophie's voice was heavy with confusion and guilt. "Edward has been dropping hints about our future lately. I think he might be planning to propose soon, and the thought terrifies me. Not because I don't love him, but because I'm not sure I love him the right way." "What's the right way?" "The way I love James, the way I still—" Sophie stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air like a confession. Edward's hands were shaking now as he navigated the familiar streets toward the restaurant. Everything he'd planned, everything he'd hoped for, was crumbling around him. The woman he wanted to marry was sitting 3 feet behind him, explaining to her best friend why the idea of his proposal filled her with terror rather than joy. As they turned onto the street where Launceston Place waited with its reserved table and hidden ring, Edward realized that his carefully orchestrated surprise had become the most painful education of his life. The remainder of the drive passed in a blur of streetlights and muffled conversation as Sophie and Emma moved on to safer topics: work gossip, weekend plans, Emma's dating disasters. Edward navigated on autopilot, his mind reeling from everything he'd heard. When they finally reached Launceston Place, the restaurant's warm glow spilling onto the sidewalk felt mockingly romantic. "Here we are, miss," Edward managed, his altered accent feeling foreign in his mouth. Sophie thanked him, gathered her things, and stepped onto the pavement without a backward glance. As her heels clicked away toward the restaurant entrance, Edward sat frozen in the driver's seat, watching the woman he'd planned to propose to disappear through the familiar doors. 20 minutes later, Edward entered the same restaurant as himself. Edward Chen, successful financial consultant, devoted boyfriend of 3 years. He'd changed clothes in the rental car, transformed back into the man Sophie expected to see, though internally he felt like a stranger to both versions of himself. Sophie was waiting at their table, the corner booth where they'd first met, looking radiant in the soft candlelight. She'd touched up her makeup and arranged her hair, and when she saw him approaching, her face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. "There you are," she said, rising to kiss him. "I was starting to worry you'd gotten lost." The kiss felt like a betrayal, not of her, but of the truth he now carried. Every gesture of affection felt tainted by what he'd learned, every smile shadowed by her confessions to Emma. "Traffic was murder," Edward said, settling into his seat across from her. "You look beautiful." "Thank you." Sophie beamed, seeming genuinely happy to be there. "This place brings back memories. Remember our first date?" Edward nodded, though the memory now felt complicated, viewed through the lens of Sophie's revelation that she felt pressured to be someone else around him. Had she felt that pressure even then, on their very first evening together? The waiter appeared with menus, and Edward found himself analyzing every interaction through this new filter. When Sophie deferred to his wine selection, was it because she trusted his taste or because she felt inadequate to choose? When she asked about his day, was it genuine interest or performed girlfriend behavior? "You seem distracted tonight," Sophie observed as their appetizers arrived. "Everything all right?" Edward forced a smile. "Just thinking about how much has changed since we first sat at this table." "Good changes, I hope," Sophie said, but Edward caught a flicker of something, anxiety, fear, across her features. "That depends," Edward heard himself saying. "Are you happy, Sophie? Really happy?" The question seemed to surprise her. She set down her fork and studied his face carefully. "That's an unexpectedly heavy question for our anniversary dinner." "Is it? Shouldn't we be able to ask each other heavy questions after 3 years?" Sophie was quiet for a moment, and Edward could see her processing not just his question, but his tone, the unusual intensity of his focus. "I'm happy," she said finally. "Are you?" It was Edward's turn to pause. Was he happy? Or had he been happy with an illusion, content with a relationship that existed more in his imagination than in reality? "I want to be," he said honestly. "I want us both to be genuinely happy, not just going through the motions of what happiness should look like." Something in Sophie's expression shifted, became more guarded. "Why do I feel like there's a subtext to this conversation I'm not getting?" Edward reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers finding the ring box. For a wild moment, he considered going through with his original plan. Maybe if he proposed now, if he offered her the tangible proof of his commitment, it would somehow override her doubts. Maybe the grand gesture would be enough to make her forget about James, about feeling like herself with someone else. But as he looked across the table at Sophie, really looked at her perhaps for the first time in months, he saw the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she was choosing her words, the subtle distance she was maintaining even in this intimate setting. This wasn't the face of a woman hoping for a proposal. This was the face of a woman bracing herself for one. Edward slowly withdrew his hand from his pocket, leaving the ring where it was. "No subtext," he said softly. "I just want to make sure we're building something real together, not just something that looks good from the outside." Sophie's eyes searched his face, and for a moment Edward thought she might be about to tell him something important, something true. Instead, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I love you, Edward," she said, and he heard the truth in her words, but also the complicated weight of everything she wasn't saying. "I love you too," he replied, and meant it, even as he realized that love might not be enough to bridge the gap between who they were and who they needed each other to be. The rest of their dinner passed in careful conversation, both of them navigating around the landmines of deeper truth, both seemingly aware that something fundamental had shifted, though only Edward knew why. The days following their anniversary dinner passed in a surreal haze of normalcy that felt like performance art. Edward went through the motions of his regular routine: morning coffee, tube to the office, client meetings, evening drinks with colleagues, but everything felt filtered through the lens of Sophie's phone conversation. Her words echoed in his mind during board meetings. "I feel like I'm playing a role in Edward's life, rather than actually living mine." Sophie, meanwhile, seemed lighter somehow, as if the conversation with Emma had released some internal pressure. She was more affectionate than usual, texting him sweet messages throughout the day, suggesting weekend plans, even initiating sex twice that week, something that had become increasingly rare in recent months. Edward wondered if her confessions to Emma had been cathartic, or if she was overcompensating for her guilt about James. The thought of James became Edward's constant companion. During client presentations, he found himself wondering what Sophie and her ex-boyfriend discussed during their secret coffee meetings. While reviewing financial reports, he'd drift into imagining their conversations about sustainable architecture and social justice. The unknown details of their relationship consumed him like a fever. Edward had never considered himself a jealous person, but he discovered that knowledge without context was its own special torture. He knew James existed, knew they were meeting, knew Sophie felt like herself with him, but he didn't know what that actually meant in practical terms. Were they just talking? Was there physical attraction? Were they actively exploring a romantic reunion? Or was Sophie simply enjoying the nostalgia of uncomplicated connection? By Wednesday, Edward's self-control cracked. During his lunch break, he found himself typing "James Morrison Architect London" into Google. The search yielded immediate results. James Morrison, 29, Senior Associate at Henderson & Associates, specializing in sustainable residential design. His professional photo showed a man with kind eyes and an easy smile, wearing the sort of casually expensive clothing that suggested success without ostentation. Edward scrolled through James's professional portfolio, impressed despite himself by the innovative housing projects and community development initiatives. This wasn't some struggling artist or idealistic dreamer. James was accomplished, successful in his own right, but in a field that aligned with Sophie's values in ways Edward's financial consulting never could. The LinkedIn profile revealed more troubling details. James had graduated from the same university as Sophie, 2 years ahead of her. His work history showed 3 years in New York, with a prestigious firm before returning to London just 4 months ago, exactly when Sophie had mentioned he'd first contacted her. That evening, Edward watched Sophie more carefully than usual. She was curled against him on the sofa, reading a novel about immigration policy, occasionally sharing interesting passages or statistics. Her passion for social issues had always been one of her most attractive qualities. But now Edward wondered if his lukewarm responses to her enthusiasm had been slowly extinguishing that passion. "This book is fascinating," Sophie said, showing him a paragraph about housing discrimination. "It makes me want to get more involved in housing advocacy." "That sounds like important work," Edward replied. But even as he said it, he could hear the careful politeness in his own voice. Why couldn't he match her enthusiasm? Why did her interests feel like items on a checklist of things he should support rather than genuinely share? "James," Sophie started, then caught herself, color rising in her cheeks. "James, what?" Edward asked, his heart rate spiking. "Nothing, I was just thinking out loud." Sophie returned to her book, but Edward could see the tension in her shoulders. The slip felt like confirmation of everything Edward feared. James wasn't just occupying Sophie's past or her occasional coffee breaks. He was infiltrating her present thoughts, her daily life, her plans for the future. That night, while Sophie slept beside him, Edward lay awake staring at the ceiling, mentally cataloguing every interaction they'd had since his discovery. Had she always taken so long to respond to his text messages? Had she always been so evasive about her exact whereabouts during late nights at the office? Or was he now imposing suspicion onto innocent behaviors? The rational part of Edward's mind recognized that he was spiraling, that his investigation was becoming obsessive and unhealthy. But the emotional part couldn't let go. He'd built his entire future around this relationship, had planned to propose marriage, had imagined growing old with Sophie. The possibility that she'd been simultaneously imagining a different future with someone else felt like a fundamental betrayal of everything he'd believed about their connection. Friday morning brought a new revelation when Sophie announced she'd be working late again, staying at the office to finish research for her wrongful dismissal case. Edward nodded supportively, kissed her goodbye, and spent the entire day wondering if she was actually meeting James. By evening, Edward found himself walking past Sophie's law firm, telling himself he was just getting some air after a long day. The building was mostly dark, with only a few scattered windows showing light from late-working solicitors. Sophie's floor was completely black. Edward stood on the sidewalk across the street, feeling like a stranger to himself. When had he become the kind of man who checked up on his girlfriend? When had love transformed into surveillance? As he walked home through the London evening, Edward realized that regardless of what Sophie was or wasn't doing with James, his own behavior was becoming unrecognizable. The man who'd planned that romantic proposal was disappearing, replaced by someone suspicious, obsessive, and deeply unhappy. The question was whether there was any way back to who they'd been before that devastating car ride, or if some truths, once heard, changed everything irreversibly. The breaking point came on a grey Tuesday afternoon when Edward decided to leave the office early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. The constant tension of monitoring Sophie's behavior while pretending everything was normal had left him genuinely exhausted, his sleep fragmented by anxiety, and his appetite diminished by the churning in his stomach. He was walking through Covent Garden, taking the long route home to clear his head when he saw them. Sophie and James sat in the window of Café Rouge, their heads bent close together over steaming coffee cups, engaged in animated conversation. Sophie's hands moved expressively as she spoke, her face more animated than Edward had seen it in months. James listened with obvious attention, occasionally reaching across the small table to touch her arm when he made a point. Edward ducked behind a newspaper stand, his heart hammering as he watched this tableau of intimacy. There was nothing overtly romantic about their interaction, no hand-holding, no lingering touches, no body language that suggested physical attraction. But there was something far more threatening, complete emotional engagement. Sophie laughed at something James said, throwing her head back in genuine delight. It was the same laugh Edward remembered from their early days together, spontaneous and unself-conscious. When had he last made her laugh like that? When had he last seen her so entirely present in a conversation? James was attractive in an understated way, tall and lean, with the kind of casual confidence that came from being comfortable in one's own skin. He wore a worn leather jacket over dark jeans, his sandy hair slightly disheveled from the wind. Everything about his appearance suggested authenticity rather than image management, the opposite of Edward's carefully curated professional persona. Edward watched for nearly 20 minutes, unable to look away despite the sick feeling in his stomach. This was clearly not their first meeting, nor was it a casual catch-up between old friends. Their conversation had the rhythm of people who'd been talking regularly, who shared inside jokes and ongoing discussions. When Sophie checked her watch and began gathering her things, Edward realized she'd been lying about working late again. This was where she'd been during at least some of those extended office hours, not reviewing legal briefs, but rediscovering herself through the eyes of someone who'd known her before she'd started trying to fit into Edward's world. As they prepared to leave, James stood and helped Sophie with her coat, his hands lingering briefly on her shoulders. Sophie looked up at him with an expression Edward recognized, but realized he hadn't seen directed at himself in months. Pure, uncomplicated affection. They walked out together, James's hand resting lightly on the small of Sophie's back as they navigated through the crowded street. Edward followed at a distance, hating himself for the surveillance, but unable to stop. They paused outside the cafe, talking for several more minutes, before finally embracing goodbye. Not a casual friend hug, but something warmer, more meaningful. After James disappeared into the tube station, Sophie stood alone on the sidewalk for a long moment, a soft smile playing around her lips. Then, as if remembering herself, she straightened her shoulders, composed her expression, and began walking in the direction of her office, presumably to establish her alibi for the evening. Edward felt something break inside his chest, not the sharp pain of betrayal, but the duller ache of recognition. Sophie wasn't cheating on him, not in any traditional sense. She was simply being herself with someone who didn't require her to be anyone else. The realization was somehow more devastating than physical infidelity would have been. Walking home through the London evening, Edward understood that he'd been witnessing the death of his relationship in real time. Not through dramatic confrontation or obvious deception, but through the slow recognition that love wasn't enough when two people needed each other to be fundamentally different than who they actually were. The ring sat in his dresser drawer, a symbol of futures that had never been as real as he'd imagined. Sophie had never been hiding her true self from him maliciously. She'd been trying to become the person she thought he needed her to be, just as he'd been unconsciously encouraging her to be someone who fit more seamlessly into his world. That night, when Sophie returned home with elaborate explanations about her late research session, Edward listened without comment, nodding sympathetically at her descriptions of challenging legal precedents. He was struck by how exhausting it must be for her to maintain these deceptions, how much energy she was expending to protect both their feelings. As they went through their evening routine, dinner conversation, television, preparation for bed, Edward felt like he was watching a performance of domestic contentment. Both of them were acting their parts, but neither was truly present. Lying in bed beside Sophie, listening to her steady breathing, Edward finally acknowledged what he'd been avoiding for weeks. Their relationship was already over. The only question now was whether they would have the courage to admit it honestly, or continue this elaborate charade until it became unbearable for both of them. The woman sleeping beside him deserved better than a love that required her to diminish herself. And Edward, painful as it was to admit, deserved better than being chosen for his suitability rather than for who he truly was. Tomorrow, he decided, they would finally have the conversation they'd both been avoiding. Edward woke before dawn on Saturday morning, Sophie still sleeping peacefully beside him, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink. The grey London light filtered through their bedroom curtains, casting everything in soft shadows that seemed appropriate for what he knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of his life. He'd spent the previous evening in careful preparation, not unlike planning a business presentation, except this time he was preparing to potentially end the most important relationship he'd ever had. Edward had rehearsed various opening lines, considered different approaches, weighed the pros and cons of revealing how he'd discovered the truth about James versus simply addressing his general concerns about their relationship. Sophie stirred as Edward slipped out of bed to make coffee, her eyes fluttering open with the sleepy confusion of weekend mornings. "What time is it?" she mumbled into her pillow. "Early," Edward said softly. "Go back to sleep. I'll bring you coffee in a bit." But Sophie was already sitting up, her hair tousled and her face soft with sleep. She looked so young and vulnerable in the morning light that Edward felt a sharp pang of loss for what they were about to lose. Not just their relationship, but this intimate domesticity they'd built together. "You seem different this week," Sophie observed, wrapping Edward's robe around herself as she padded to the kitchen behind him. "More distant. Is work stress getting to you?" Edward busied himself with the coffee machine, buying time. "Actually, I've been thinking about us, about our relationship." The words hung in the air, and Edward could feel Sophie's energy shift behind him, becoming more alert, more cautious. "What about our relationship?" "Sit down," Edward said gently, carrying 2 cups to their small dining table. "There's something I need to tell you, and it's going to be complicated." Sophie settled across from him, cupping her mug in both hands like a shield. "You're scaring me, Edward." "I know. I'm sorry." Edward took a deep breath, then launched into the story he'd rehearsed. "Last Friday, for our anniversary, I planned to surprise you. I disguised myself as a ride-share driver to pick you up from work." Sophie's eyes widened. "What? Why would you—" "I wanted to surprise you. Take you to Launceston Place and—" Edward pulled the ring box from his pocket, setting it on the table between them. Sophie stared at it as if it were a dangerous animal. "Edward," she whispered. "I was going to propose," he continued. "I had it all planned out. The restaurant where we met, the perfect timing, the perfect words." His voice grew quieter. "But during the drive, you got a phone call from Emma." Understanding dawned across Sophie's face like a slow sunrise, followed immediately by horror. "Oh, God, you heard—" "I heard everything." Edward's voice was steady despite the tremor in his hands. about feeling like you're playing a role in my life, about James, about being terrified of the idea that I might propose. Sophie buried her face in her hands. Edward, I can explain. You don't need to explain, Edward interrupted gently. You don't need to apologize or justify anything you said. You were having an honest conversation with your best friend. The problem isn't that you said those things. The problem is that they're true. Sophie looked up, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I do love you, Edward. I need you to know that. I know you do. And I love you. But we both know that love isn't always enough, is it? The silence that followed was heavy, with 3 years of accumulated misunderstandings, unspoken resentments, and good intentions that had somehow gone wrong. Sophie reached for the ring box, opening it to reveal the elegant solitaire that Edward had chosen so carefully. It's beautiful, she said softly. It's exactly what I would have chosen. But you would have said no. Sophie closed the box, her fingers tracing its velvet surface. I don't know, maybe. Yes, probably. She looked up at him with devastating honesty. Not because I don't love you, but because saying yes would have felt like agreeing to become someone I'm not sure I can be. Edward nodded. And asking you to marry me would have been asking you to be someone you don't want to be. When did we get so lost? Sophie asked, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of his robe. When did loving each other become so complicated? Maybe it was always complicated, and we just ignored the complications because we wanted it to work so badly. Edward reached across the table, covering her hand with his. I keep thinking about what you said to Emma, about feeling like yourself with James. I realized that I can't remember the last time I felt like you were completely yourself with me. Sophie's tears fell freely now. I've been trying so hard to be the woman you needed me to be that I forgot how to just be myself around you. And I think you've been trying so hard to help me become better that you forgot to just love who I already am. The admission hung between them, painful but liberating. Edward felt some of the tension he'd been carrying for weeks begin to release, replaced by a strange sense of relief. The truth was devastating, but it was also clarifying. What do we do now? Sophie asked. Edward was quiet for a long moment, considering their options. They could try couples therapy, attempt to rebuild their relationship on more honest foundations. They could take a break, see if time and space would give them perspective. They could ignore this conversation and continue as they had been, hoping that love would eventually smooth over their fundamental incompatibilities. But as he looked at Sophie, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months, Edward saw the same recognition in her eyes that he felt in his heart. They had both been trying to force a relationship that looked perfect from the outside, but felt wrong from the inside. I think, Edward said slowly, we need to be brave enough to admit that wanting something to work isn't the same as it actually working. Sophie nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I think you're right. They sat in the grey morning light, holding hands across the table, the unopened ring box between them, like a monument to roads not taken. It wasn't the conversation Edward had imagined having during their anniversary weekend, but it was perhaps the most honest conversation they'd ever shared. Outside their window, London was waking up, the sounds of Saturday morning traffic, neighbours calling to each other, life continuing its relentless forward momentum. Soon they would have to figure out the practical details of separation, the division of belongings and spaces, and the shared life they'd built together. But for now they simply sat together in the truth they'd finally been brave enough to speak aloud, mourning not just their relationship, but the people they'd been trying to be for each other, and beginning to imagine who they might become apart. The cafe in Bloomsbury where Edward sat was nothing like the elegant establishments he usually frequented. The chairs were mismatched, the artwork was clearly created by local students, and the coffee was served in chipped mugs rather than pristine cups. 6 months ago, he would never have chosen such a place. Today, he found the imperfection oddly comforting. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, his therapist, had suggested he try new environments as part of what she called expanding your comfort zone beyond the familiar patterns. It was one of many suggestions that had initially irritated Edward with their simplicity, but which had proven surprisingly effective. Therapy, he'd discovered, was largely about recognizing the obvious truths you'd been avoiding. Edward pulled out his laptop and began reviewing the quarterly reports for his newest client, a non-profit organization developing affordable housing initiatives across London. The work paid significantly less than his traditional corporate consulting, but it offered something his previous clients never had, the feeling that his financial expertise was contributing to something meaningful. Small changes, Dr. Mitchell had said during their first session, when Edward had expressed frustration with the entire concept of therapy. We're not trying to become different people. We're trying to become more honest about who we already are. The process had been more difficult than Edward anticipated. Acknowledging his tendency toward unconscious condescension had been particularly painful, forcing him to re-examine not just his relationship with Sophie, but his interactions with colleagues, friends, and family. He'd been horrified to recognize the same patronizing patterns in his behavior toward his assistant, his younger brother, even his parents. The need to improve other people often comes from our own insecurities, Dr. Mitchell had observed. When we can't accept certain aspects of ourselves, we project those anxieties onto the people we love. Edward's phone buzzed with a text from Tom, his younger brother. "Still on for dinner Sunday? Bring that housing report you mentioned. Sounds fascinating." The message made Edward smile. His relationship with Tom had improved dramatically since Edward had stopped offering unsolicited career advice and started actually listening to his brother's perspectives on art and creativity. Through the cafe window, Edward watched London's weekend foot traffic. Young couples holding hands, families with strollers, elderly men walking dogs, teenagers in groups laughing loudly at shared jokes. 6 months ago, he would have observed this scene with detached interest, perhaps making mental notes about demographic trends or consumer behavior. Now he simply watched, aware of the individual stories and struggles behind each face. His laptop chimed with an email notification. Edward's chest tightened when he saw the sender, Sophie Hamilton. They'd maintained sporadic contact since their separation, practical communications about shared belongings, forwarded mail, the gradual untangling of intertwined lives. But this email felt different. "Hi, Edward," it began. "I hope you're doing well. I wanted to let you know that I'm moving to Edinburgh next month. I've accepted a position with a legal aid organization that specializes in housing rights. The pay is terrible, but the work feels important in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I thought you should hear it from me rather than through mutual friends." Edward paused in his reading, processing this news. Sophie was leaving London entirely, starting fresh in a city where neither of them had history. It felt like the final closing of a chapter that had already ended. "I also wanted to tell you," the email continued, "that James and I are not together. We tried, briefly, but realized that nostalgia isn't the same as compatibility. It turns out that knowing who you were at 20 doesn't necessarily mean knowing who you are at 28. I'm learning to be comfortable with figuring out who I am without reference to any relationship." Edward felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that Sophie wasn't simply replacing him with James, sadness that she was moving so far away, and a strange pride in her decision to prioritize meaningful work over financial security. "I think about our conversations sometimes," Sophie's email concluded. "How brave we were to tell each other the truth, even when it hurt. I hope you're finding ways to be yourself without having to fix anyone else. You're a good man, Edward. You deserve love that doesn't require you to be anything other than exactly who you are. Take care of yourself. Sophie." Edward sat back in his chair, staring at the email for several minutes. The finality of it was both painful and liberating. Sophie was moving forward, building a life that aligned with her values rather than her expectations or anyone else's vision of who she should be. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed an unknown number, which Edward might have ignored in the past but now answered out of curiosity. "Edward Chen, this is Maria Santos from the Shelter Point Housing Collective. I got your number from the Affordable Housing Initiative. We're looking for a financial consultant who understands our mission, rather than just our budget. Would you be interested in discussing a partnership?" Edward smiled, closing his laptop. "I'd be very interested. When would be a good time to meet?" As he scheduled the appointment, Edward reflected on how much his professional priorities had shifted. 6 months ago, he would have evaluated potential clients based on prestige and profit margins. Now he found himself drawn to organizations whose missions resonated with his growing understanding of what meaningful work might look like. After ending the call, Edward sat in the busy cafe for a few more minutes, watching the Saturday afternoon crowd and thinking about the future. He wasn't dating anyone yet. Dr. Mitchell had suggested taking time to become comfortable with solitude before seeking another relationship. The advice had initially felt unnecessary, but Edward was discovering the truth in it. For the first time in his adult life, he was learning to enjoy his own company without feeling the need to improve or optimize himself. The ring he'd planned to give Sophie sat in his sock drawer at home, not as a symbol of failure but as a reminder of hard-won wisdom. Someday he might offer it to someone else, but only when he was certain that his love was about celebration rather than transformation, about acceptance rather than improvement. Outside the cafe, London pulsed with its eternal rhythm of ambition and dreams, heartbreak and renewal. Edward gathered his things and stepped back into the flow of the city, no longer trying to direct its current, but finally learning to move with it, curious about where it might carry him next. The truths that had destroyed his relationship with Sophie had also freed him to become someone he'd never imagined being, someone who could love without needing to fix, who could offer his skills without demanding recognition, who could sit in an imperfect cafe and find it beautiful exactly as it was. It wasn't the ending he'd planned, but it was perhaps the beginning he'd needed all along. And now, tell me, what rating would you give to this story of love and new beginnings? Which part touched your heart the most? Your participation is so important for us to continue bringing stories that truly move people. And take a moment to share. From which city or country are you watching? It's always a joy to know how far our stories reach and how they touch people in different corners of the world. There are many other exciting stories waiting for you here on the Soul of History channel. Click on the recommended videos on your screen and continue this journey with us. Thank you so much for being part of this community that believes in love, hope, and new beginnings. May God bless you and your family, and we'll see you in the next video.